Have any of you ever heard, maybe I should get over here and get in the frame so we don't mess up the video for later. Have any of you ever heard the name Richard Wurmbrand? Anybody familiar with the man Richard Wurmbrand? Okay. Wurmbrand was a pastor. He was an Anglican pastor. He was a Lutheran pastor. He lived in Romania first during the Nazi occupation during World War II, and later during the Soviet occupation after World War II. And it was during that Soviet occupation that in 1948, Wurmbrand was arrested for the first time for preaching Jesus. The Soviet Union, if you're not familiar, Soviet-style communism was inherently atheistic. Pastors at this time in occupied countries, if they wanted to remain pastors, they needed to basically pledge their allegiance to the Soviet leaders. They needed to follow the rules put out by the Soviet occupiers. And of course, those rules greatly limited what the pastors could preach. And a question we might think about ourselves every so often, if it was illegal to tell others about Jesus, would we still tell others about Jesus? Of course, it's really easy for us sitting here in this comfortable air-conditioned building where in a country where we have true religious freedom, where we can worship as we see fit. It's easy for us to say, well, yeah, of course I would still tell people about Jesus. But our answer might change if we were threatened with arrest and imprisonment or even death just for saying the name Jesus. Wurmbrand was sent to prison for the first time for 8.5 years, 3 years of which were in solitary confinement, in a cell that was 12 feet underground. There were no lights, there were no windows, there was no sound there either, as the guards purposefully wore felt on the soles of their shoes so they wouldn't even make noise walking down the hall. Wurmbrand was released from that imprisonment in 1956, but in 1959 he was arrested again, this time being sentenced to 25 years in prison. But this time it wasn't as simple as solitary confinement. This time he was beaten, he was tortured, his body was mutilated, he was burned, he was placed in a large frozen box. One example he recalled was that the soles of his feet were beaten until the flesh was torn off. And then the next day they came back and beat his feet some more until it went down to the bone. He endured all of this because he preached Christ. Wurmbrand was granted amnesty in 1964, and he was eventually able to leave Romania after being convinced from friends and people in his congregation to leave Romania because he wasn't safe there. And if he left, he could be a voice for the persecuted church around the world. If you're at all interested in his story, I actually have several copies of this book. It's called Tortured for Christ. If you'd like a copy of that, come see me after church. I would love to gift you a copy of that. I mention Richard Wurmbrand because he's a modern-day example of what many Christians have experienced throughout the history of the church. If we go back to the early church, back to the first century, people who followed the way, so it was being called early on is the way, all of this is happening in the Roman Empire. And remember too, Rome has this imperial cult, this cult of emperor worship, this pagan, polytheistic, many gods religion that the people there are expected to follow. Except for Jewish people. Jewish people were excluded from participating in this cult. They were still under Roman authority, but because they worshiped just the one God of the universe, they were not expected to participate in any of the pagan festivals or sacrifices or anything like that. And again, early on in Christianity, for at least a little while, Christianity was considered part of Judaism. It was considered kind of an offshoot of Judaism. So Christians, too, at this time, were granted this exemption. By the end of the first century, however, which is the time frame Revelation was written, By the end of the first century, it's getting to a point where Judaism and Christianity are becoming two separate groups. They're splitting off from one another. And Christians no longer have this protection that being considered Jewish gives them. And they're no longer allowed to abstain from the practices of this Roman imperial cult. And this brings us now to the church in Smyrna here in Revelation. Remember, these messages to the 7 churches in Asia Minor are not so much intended to be individual letters. It's not a letter here, give this letter to Ephesus, give this letter to Smyrna. I know we often refer to them as letters, and out of habit I might say the letter to Smyrna at some point. But let's keep of them more the idea that it's a message. They have specifics to each church, but they're intended to be read by all of the churches of Asia Minor. There's more than just 7 churches in Asia Minor. They're intended to be read by all of these churches, and frankly, they're intended to be read today in our churches, just like we're doing right now. Something else we're going to be noticing through the rest of these messages, the rest of these letters, if you will, is, starting in Smyrna, there are some very, very specific things that apply to that church. And they might not be real obvious unless you lived in Smyrna or are familiar with the area, or you've read commentaries by people that are really, really smart, and they say, hey, this is what this actually means. There's this double meaning here. So there's a lot of other things in these letters, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Verse 8 starts out and says, "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again." The first and the last, who died and came to life again. If you recall our introduction, this is bringing us back to the introduction in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever." So it's that introduction in chapter 1 that's telling us who is receiving the message. It tells us that John is receiving it. It could be John the Apostle, might be another John. Whoever it is, it's a guy named John receiving this message on the island of Patmos. And who is the message from? The message is from Jesus. There's another illustration here. So it tells us who's writing the overall letter that is Revelation, who's writing the message to the church in Smyrna. But this verse that says who died and came to life again also refers to something else. Around the year 600 BCE, the city of Smyrna was destroyed by a group called the Lydians. And by 290 BCE, Smyrna was rebuilt and restored to be a great city. So the city of Smyrna itself had died and come back to life. So it's one of those city-specific things that people in Smyrna would know. We go on. Verse 9, "I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich." Of course, the implication here is that, and in a lot of other sources, and a lot of history tells us Smyrna was a rich city. But the Christians didn't share in that material wealth. The people might have been living in poverty, but Jesus says, guys, you're still rich. You might not have a lot of money, you might not have a lot of possessions, but you're still rich. You are rich in faith. You'll notice this message to Smyrna has no rebuke. There's no condemnation in this message. If you remember when we talked about our message to Ephesus, it says, guys, you're doing great, you're absolutely nailing it, way to go, but, that big but comes in there, right? The last thing you ever want to hear Jesus say to you, yet I hold this against you, it's like, oh no. So that was the message to Ephesus, but we don't get that message in Smyrna. As opposed to, you're doing great, but we get, you guys are doing great. Keep it up. Unfortunately, because they're doing well, they're going to face some terrible persecution. The second half of verse 9 says this, "I know about the slanders of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." This verse is not the easiest to understand. Frankly, there are a lot of different ideas as to exactly what it means. Who comprises this synagogue of Satan? Does Jesus mean that his followers, Christians, are now the true Jews because they have recognized Jesus as the Messiah, as this promised Messiah? Does he mean that there are people saying that they're Jews and coming to the Christians, but they're not actually Jews in any way? I mean, think about it. There's a lot of people who say they're Christians today that don't follow Christ. Does this message simply mean Jewish people in general? There's evidence that the Jews of Smyrna participated in some of the persecution of the Christians. In fact, in 155 CE, Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, was martyred. He was executed. And many believe that there were groups of Jewish people in Smyrna that were participating in encouraging to get him executed. Now, we do need to be very careful when we come across verses like this, because this verse and many others have been interpreted in ways to make Jewish people look bad and have been used as an excuse to persecute Jewish people over the centuries. So we need to try to understand best what this really does mean. So what does it mean? One of the problems with reading from a bunch of different sources is you don't always get one definitive answer. It's just kind of how it is. So I don't know exactly 100% what is being talked about here with this synagogue of Satan, who is being referred to. But what we can know for certain is that there were people in Smyrna who were spreading lies about the Christians. They're slandering them, that's what slander is, to make them look bad. And this is going to bring about the persecution of Christians in Smyrna. Our video this morning, our host on the video was talking about the lies were things that people were spreading about when Christians gather for communion. They're eating the body and blood of Christ. So that means that Christians are cannibals because we're eating body and drinking blood. So this rumor goes around that Christians are cannibals. Well, we know that's not true. It could be a lot of different rumors that people started about Christians. And those rumors are what bring about this persecution of Christians in Smyrna. Remember, though, I've been trying to say for the last couple of weeks, Revelation isn't so much a book about doom and gloom and destruction and disaster and death and hell and damnation. It's a book of hope. It's a book about God's victory. Remember that as we look at it. Verse 10a, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Everyone is about to suffer. Some will be put in prison and persecuted for 10 days. 10 days, that doesn't seem too bad. I think we can all endure a little bit of persecution for 10 days and then it's done, right? Well, there's a lot of symbolism here. We got to understand what the 10 days thing means. Again, there's a couple of possibilities. It might just be a random number saying, hey, you're going to go to prison and be persecuted for a while. 10 days may not literally mean 10 days. It could just be that they'll be in prison and persecuted for a period of time, an undetermined period of time, but some specific period of time. Our host in our video again this morning said it was a common turn of phrase at the time for a short while. It's another possibility. Something else to keep in mind, though. The Romans didn't tend to put people in prison just to put them in prison. Today, people are put in prison after being convicted of a crime. They're sentenced to a specific amount of time to spend in prison as a punishment. Well, in Rome, people were generally going to be put in prison simply as a place to be held before they were executed. In one of the commentaries I was reading this week, one of the researchers mentioned they found evidence that a 10-day sentence was how long people were kept in prison before they were sent into the arena as a gladiator or to face a gladiator or as a victim of a gladiator or a victim in the games. And that could be the meaning here. Some of the Smyrna Christians were going to be sent to prison for 10 days, and at the end of those 10 days, they're going to be sent to the games where they would be executed. Again, whatever this means exactly, it's not going to be a good thing for the health of the faithful Christians of Smyrna. In spite of all this, Jesus continues in verse 10. He says, "Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown." Remember, this is really the whole theme of Revelation. Yes, you will face hardship. Yes, you will face persecution. But stay faithful to God, because in the end, what have I said about Revelation? God wins. Right? God wins. Stay faithful to God, because in the end, God wins. Even if you die, stay faithful to God. If you do, you will be given life as the victor's crown. Now, I absolutely love the way the NIV translates this here. Most translations in this verse will say, "I will give you the crown of life," which is a fine translation. It works. It tells you what's going on here. It gets the point across. But when we think of a crown, often we think of this. This is a picture of King Charles III. So that's King Charles III, Queen Camilla, at their coronation last year. He's wearing a crown. She's wearing a crown. This is what we tend to think of when someone is wearing a crown. This is a royal crown, not the cola. This is actual, you know that's what RC stands for, right? Okay. Wow, that didn't hit at all. Let's go back. This is a crown. This is a royal crown. How does one get a royal crown? Their mom or dad gives it to them, right? How did King Charles III become king? His mother was the queen. How did Queen Elizabeth II become queen? Her father was the king. It's passed down from generation to generation to generation. If you were to look in the original Greek, the original language of the New Testament, the word for this type of crown, a royal crown, a crown that shows that the bearer has power and authority, the word for that crown in the Greek is diadem. The word for that kind of crown is diadem. Some of you might have an old hymn just came into your head. All hail the power. That's not the right key. All hail the power of Jesus' name. Let angels prostrate fall. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. I promise I won't sing again until at least next week. But did you catch it? Crown him with the royal diadem. Bring forth the royal diadem. In the song, it's talking about Jesus having power, having royal power, because he's wearing this diadem, this crown. Of course, he doesn't have power because he's wearing the crown. He's wearing the crown because he has his power and authority. But here in Revelation, we're not talking about that kind of crown. The word used here in Revelation is Stephanos. It means a victor's crown. This is a crown that one would have gotten for winning a race or winning a game or winning a contest of some sort. One gets this for being victorious. I have a picture here. This is from the 2022 Beijing Olympics. You can tell because they're wearing masks. That was the Olympics a couple of years ago. But if you notice, we'll zoom in on the one here. Not that one. But yes, sign up for Mexico missions. December 26th through the 31st, going to go down to Reynosa, Mexico, and build a house. And we're going to have fun, and we're going to buy kids Coca-Cola. And so anyway, if you look closely, not what the athletes are wearing, but there's those little pandas on there. They have that laurel wreath around the panda. And that is a victor's crown. Consider that the athletes would probably be wearing something like that at that point. For whatever reason, it was just, there we go. Yes, thank you. So that gold around the panda is the Stephanos. It's the victor's crown. So again, this crown is not something you just get from mom or dad. It's not a participation trophy. It's not a, you tried, good job, here's a pat on the head, good job, way to go. It's not that kind of crown. The people that get this kind of crown, they receive the victory. This is a victor's crown. So when we talk about, as faithful Christians, when we talk about staying faithful and getting the victor's crown, we're staying faithful to God even in the face of terrible, terrible persecution and death. And it's at that point that we receive this victor's crown. There's another thing about the crown idea here that's specific to Smyrna. Ancient Smyrna was a port city. There were mountains not far in the distance. The city actually extended to the mountains. And this city specifically extended to a mountain called Mount Pagus. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but Mount Pagus, that's the name of the one. And it is said that if one stood at the harbor and looked through the city and looked toward the mountain spreading out before them up to Mount Pagus, the mount was like a crown for the city. So we have these connections specifically to Smyrna. Jesus died and came back to life. Smyrna died and came back to life. The people will get the victor's crown if they remain faithful. Smyrna is a city that has a crown. There's one last verse in this section. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Remember, this is message or letter is not just for the church of Smyrna, but for all Christians who read Revelation. And then this section closes by saying, the one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Many people today reject the idea of hell. They say, well, how can God send people to hell? How can a loving God send people to hell? Well, the truth is God doesn't send people to hell. That's already our default destination. That's where we're going to go unless we surrender our life to Jesus, unless we stay faithful to God so that we may be victorious. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. The first death is physical death. It's something all of us will very likely face, unless Jesus comes back first and we all get to be with him in his new kingdom, this new Jerusalem, before we face that physical death. But very likely every one of us is going to face that physical death. But the second death is the one we don't want to face. That death is the one that separates us eternally from our loving Father in heaven. That's the death that sends us to hell. But I have good news for you. I have really good news for you. Really, really, really good news for you. God doesn't want any of us to go there. Not one of us. He wants us all to be saved. In 2 Peter we read, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. I did a funeral several years ago, and the gentleman that passed away was a huge classic rock fan. His favorite band was Led Zeppelin. And the only request he had for his funeral was that we play Stairway to Heaven. And we play it loud enough that the windows rattled. That was pretty awesome. And I know some people that were there didn't much care for that, but honestly, the most difficult part for me was sitting up by the pulpit and not starting to air drum when that came on. But part of my message that day, I used some lyrics from the song Stairway. And there's a verse in the song that says, yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 7, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. There's a wide road, and there's a thin road. The wide road is the road most people are on. It's the default road. Most people don't even realize they're on this wide, broad road. And that's the road that leads away from God. That's the road that leads to the second death. The thin road is the road we need to hop on. We need to take the exit, and we need to get on that route. Now, there's a toll booth there, but the toll was already paid for us. It was paid by somebody else. Yes, there are two paths. The question is, which one are you on today? If you're on the broad road, that wide path that leads to destruction, let today be the day that you change the road you're on. There is time. If you are still breathing, there is time to change the path you are following. You don't have to pay anything. There's no membership fees to be a Christ follower. You don't have to do anything first. There's no prerequisites. There's no requirements to get right with God before you start down the road to life. You simply must believe.